Welcome to the Compass Audiocast. I'm your host, Hawa Kambian. Prepare to revisit the compassionate wisdom many of us heard in our youth so that we can mindfully apply it to reimagine a future of work that we can all shape for the better. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am beyond thrilled and grateful to have you join me here on our first episode of the Compass Audiocast, where we focus on the past, the present, and the positive in terms of how we can move forward and continue to grow here as we create the future of work together. So the quote that I shared this week with everyone was a quote that says, "It's okay to cry." And that quote was aligned to the date of January 18th. And of course, for whenever you may be listening to this sentiment and this idea still applies. So for me, when I was a child and I heard the quote, or I read the quote, "It's okay to cry," I used to reflect on the fact that, as a kid, it's okay to be sensitive to life around you. And honestly, when I reflect on my life, most of the tears I ever experienced were when I was a child, right? From crying for our needs based on the fact that we can't really speak and express ourselves, to really crying just being that sort of accessible outlet for when needs aren't being met. You know, it is quite a natural thing to do as a child, and the older we get, the more we are socialized out of the comfort and the ease of crying, right? And so by the time I started working professionally, I'm pretty sure I probably just breezed past this quote whenever I would see it in my calendar, because there was no way I could take that seriously, especially as a woman in the workplace. No one would take me seriously, especially in the kinds of workplaces that I wanted to be in, right? All of the things that I value, like respect, maturity, sentiments like that I felt made me seem worthy and likable in the workplace, are not things that I would ever associate with crying. So it was a non-starter for me. It wasn't something that was necessarily even part of my practice or how I would show up, or kind of wearing that sensitivity openly. So when it comes to my more recent and more current work life, this quote stood out to me, and I wanted to share this quote with everyone because it reminds me of a time in the workplace when I ended up having a big old cry after attempting to have an accountability conversation with another leader in my organization, based on the fact that this leader's performance was not necessarily where top level executives in the organization were hoping it would be. And so the way that I perceived the problem on the surface level was that the leader that I was chatting to didn't recognize or appreciate my identity, my role, what I was coming in to do, and frankly, probably even the conversation we were having at the time, right? Because I was asked by a most senior person to speak to someone who was not a direct report to me, right? To speak to someone who was of a collegiate nature to me in the organization, right? Someone who I would deem as a peer, and also someone who on paper had way more experience and authority than I did, right? So the problem for me was that I walked into that situation, was met with a really unpleasant and unprofessional reaction from this person, and I felt a ton of shame, right? And so that's on the surface level for sure. However, I still want to go a level deeper, right? Because my definition of the problem that I just shared with you all is based on my perception, right? And so it then begs the question, well, why did I perceive it that way? Why did I perceive that I wasn't being recognized or appreciated? And ultimately for me, it came down to the fact that I was trying to prove my worth through my work, through my role, through my job. And I was also trying to prove that I could handle stepping into a leadership conversation, and I could be that person. I could be that go-to person to help steer the growth and the progress of the business by being trusted and relied upon to have those kinds of conversations with people. 100%. That was a big part of what was going on. So, now if we talk about what was going on when I was in that situation and that triggered the tears and the crying, frankly, my negative state was that I was overwhelmed and I was totally scattered and felt blindsided by, being in a situation where my fellow colleague was having such a negative reaction to me trying to do what I thought was align on a simple follow-up task, right? And the positive state that I really wanted was I really wanted and even thought that I was going into a conversation where I was clear and confident about what I was doing and what was needed in the situation. And frankly, I think a lot of people who end up in roles where you're coordinating, that can be the case sometimes because there's such a tactical element of coordinating or checking in or doing verification that often the deeper nuances can get missing. And that is what is so important that I really want to touch on, because this is where, the work experience development piece comes in, right? Because I was not only a young woman early on in my career and craving that confidence as a leader, right? And really wanting to be seen and perceived as a capable leader in that way. At the same time, what I was missing was that understanding of the strategic nuance and the underlying relationship dynamics that come when we're in the workplace, and more so when the topic of performance comes up, right? And when you have that understanding, you can have much more constructive and positive conversations with people where there's a mutual understanding, right? Where it doesn't feel like an attack on anyone, and it can feel more objective, and any sort of heightened emotion or tension or miscommunication can be distilled down into a calmer and more balanced conversation. So why is this whole point important, right? I'd like to talk a little bit about the mindset that I sort of move with now, having gone through that situation in the past, right? So again, the problem as I had perceived it and shared earlier was that I was not being recognized or appreciated for my role. However, now when I think about being in situations where that might be the case, the approach that I use now, instead of just kind of jumping in and saying, yeah, of course I can handle that, of course I can do that, which there's nothing wrong with having that level of confidence. At the same time, what actually makes me feel more confident now is leaning into curiosity. And I ask a lot of questions. Folks who've worked with me, I think, will attest to the fact that I'm quite inquisitive and I like to have a deeper understanding of the dynamic and the context that's going on before we spend energy on anything. Because, in my humble opinion, that is one of the best ways to make sure that you're on the same page with other people and that we're all, metaphorically, we're all rowing in the same direction. We're all singing from the same song sheet instead of what can often happen in organizations, and especially tech remote organizations, where we don't always have the luxury of pulling all the relevant parties into the same room to get a really clear understanding of what's happening. And people, sometimes it's a Slack message, sometimes it's like a random side chat with your bestie at work, right? But information passes in all of these new and unique ways, and critical information or critical context can get lost. And so what I like to do now is really make sure that I'm asking the important questions. And, sometimes to the point where it might even frustrate people who want me to just put my head down and get stuff done. However, to me, that's not real leadership. Just asking people to close their eyes and move blindly in the name of productivity. Real leadership is understanding or helping to create an understanding of the different dimensions of what is happening in a situation and what you're asking other people to do. When you have that understanding, you can actually have the tools to navigate yourself and others through it. So for me, it's not about wearing my ego and my sense of worth as a superhero cape and rushing in based on the idea that, well, if I'm driven enough and I have enough willpower, this will all go wonderfully. And there will be there will be nothing uncertain to navigate as long as I'm confident. Confidence is a beautiful thing when it has a healthy dose of realism, humility, and compassion, right? So the life change that I've experienced from reframing a painful situation in this way and walking in the light of more curiosity is that now I can recognize that for me, that crying was a signpost of more than just what people might assume on the surface, right? I think, and let me speak for myself, everyone. I've definitely had moments where I've looked at crying as weakness, or I've judged it as not having the strength, the inner strength, the determination, the perseverance to handle something. I've judged myself that way. I've judged others that way, right? However, now I really embrace crying simply as a indicator. It's an indicator for me. And I'll delve into this a little bit deeply, right? Because I can now trace the fact that I was crying. Crying was simply the expression of a feeling of overwhelm, right? I did not feel like I had the tools in a particular situation, and I felt it so strongly that it expressed itself as crying. So why did I feel overwhelmed? So actually, when I traced the root of my overwhelm, that was because I was in a situation that I was actually really angry about. And if you had asked me at the time, I don't think the word or the definition of anger would have come up in my vocabulary. But when I look back, I was angry about what had happened. I was angry that I had been in a situation where I felt disrespected through my exchange with this colleague. However, again, it expressed itself as crying, right? So I think it's important to recognize, firstly, that our emotions are so complex, and you might feel one thing and your body might express it in a completely different way. So it's important to acknowledge that and see that in ourselves. And also when we see other people express in a certain way, to not necessarily jump to conclusions about, oh, they were feeling this, they were feeling that, because there's probably a lot more going on under the surface. So anger, right? I was feeling anger. Why was I angry? So when I look back at this, the anger was actually because a boundary had been crossed, right? Somewhere along the line, I felt that I had not been acknowledged or respected by the people I was interacting with in that situation. And that crossing of a boundary, that crossing of a line where I could say my needs are being met and I'm being respected in a situation had been crossed. And that made me angry. And that anger was overwhelming. And that overwhelm is what triggered the tears. So again, for me, the really important lesson here that comes from all of that is that your emotions don't necessarily express the complexity of everything that someone is feeling. And for me, what I was feeling, right? And now in the present moment, it's all about bringing it back to the curiosity for me around what is my role and what am I here to accomplish, and making sure that I'm having those important strategic conversations with whomever has asked me to go and contribute or collaborate or participate in an organization, right? And then it's about thinking through, okay, based on the role that I'm in, how can I be mindful and thoughtful about the people that I'm collaborating with or the person that I'm being asked to go and have a conversation with, right? How can I actually kind of do the mental exercise of thinking through and getting a better understanding? It will always be a limited understanding, but it's still a much more mindful approach than just rushing in to, be productive and solve problems and get things done. And then lastly, making sure that in the scope of all of those interactions, that I am respecting my own personal and professional boundaries, right? And to me, it all comes down to my definition of success. And to me, it's really being able to understand that I can harmonize my duty to the role that I'm in, my sense of collaboration and camaraderie with my colleagues, and my own sense of self-respect at work, that they don't have to be competing priorities, right? And I sincerely believe that when leaders and organizations can help foster that and can help remove the smoke and mirrors and confusion from some of these situations, that's when you actually help to create an environment where people feel psychologically safe, where they then have trust in the system and trust in the people that they work with. And it makes it a lot easier to have a conversation that might be potentially awkward or confusing or frustrating for people. So thank you all for tuning into the Compass Audiocast, where we bridge past, present, and positive for the future of work. Please like this post if you found it useful, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe if you want to be notified when our next one comes out. Leave me a comment to share how you've dealt with similar pressures or how you would deal in a similar situation. Thanks, and I'll catch you on the next one.